So I was just in the shower, and my first thought was, I have a lot of handheld systems. I should probably make a video talking about them. So while my hair is drying and the sun is starting to go down outside, why not talk about the many handheld systems that I have? So we're just going to go through them and just talk about a little bit about each one, where I got each one, and a little history behind each one. So what better place to start than the original Game Boy? Released in 1989. It was the first real, I don't want to say real foray into the handheld gaming market for Nintendo, because the Game & Watch was released before the Game Boy. But most people don't know the Game & Watch. They know the Game Boy since it was such a cultural icon. So it was originally bundled with Tetris and in some cases Super Mario Land here in the US. So just having Tetris with it made the game absolutely blow up. It made the system absolutely blow up. So Game Boy was definitely a really big deal here in North America and in Japan. So I got this one in fall 2019. I think I just went home for a random weekend from college, stopped at the game store, and said, I just want to buy something. So original Game Boy was $40 at the time. It's unfortunately not $40 anymore, but yeah, it was cool to finally get like the original Game Boy, since I never had one prior to that. And this is also one of 4 Game Boys that we're going to see today that was also IPS modded. So prior to me going absolutely ballistic collecting, you're going to hear where a lot of these consoles came from. But at one point I did just have an original Game Boy, a Game Boy Color, a Game Boy Advance, and a Game Boy Advance SP. And all 4 of those systems I got IPS modded to have a better screen so that you could actually play them and not, kind of be squinting the entire time while you're playing it. So that was one of the 4 systems, and it's just cool to have a piece of original gaming history in terms of the boom by Nintendo. So after the Game Boy was released in 1989, 7 years later came the Game Boy Pocket. So the Game Boy Pocket is really just an original Game Boy, and you might notice that they are roughly, well, not roughly, the Pocket is definitely a lot smaller than the original Game Boy, and that was the entire purpose, to be a smaller, more efficient system. So one of those efficiency things is being smaller, being able to literally fit in your pocket, as opposed to the original Game Boy, which was a little large, but also doesn't take nearly as much battery power, so definitely a lot more efficient in that way. I have 3 of them, so here's one of them. This is the pink Game Boy Pocket. This one was from Japan. A lot of these systems are going to be from Japan. And this one was actually originally bundled with a Tamagotchi game that came in a pink cartridge. So that's pretty cool. I also have that pink cartridge. It's somewhere with all my Game Boy games, but this is cool. Japanese pink Game Boy Pocket. And then I also have 2 complete in box Game Boy Pockets from Japan, a black one and a yellow one. So those are cool to add too. So you're gonna, like I said, you're going to hear a lot of Japanese systems in this video. About 2 summers ago, yes, I guess about 2 years ago at this point, I went on an eBay binge where I was buying just about, I found a seller that had a bunch of listings that would start like super cheap auctions, and then I just kept winning auctions, and so I ended up with a lot of stuff. So a lot of these consoles came from that seller having won auctions from them. So anytime I mention the Japanese binge, there you go. It was about 2 summers ago. So, and then after the Game Boy Pocket, so the Game Boy Pocket is basically an original Game Boy, just smaller. And then one more revision of the original Game Boy before they moved to the Game Boy Color was the Game Boy Light. So the Game Boy Light was only released in Japan, right? Original Game Boy was released here in North America. The Pocket was released here in North America, but the Game Boy Light only released in Japan in 1998. So a whole 9 years after the original Game Boy was released, and this was by far the biggest upgrade to date. So the Game Boy Pocket was, again, essentially just a Game Boy, just smaller, but the Game Boy Light had the added functionality of having a backlit screen. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, a backlit screen just means it is significantly easier to look at. The original Game Boy is known for kind of having this PEA green screen that could be difficult to see at some points. Same thing with the Pocket, but the Game Boy Light, which I don't have any batteries in this one, but you turn it on, it's a lot brighter, way easier to see. You can see it in the day, you can see it at night, you can see it at all times of day. However, and the system we're about to talk about, it's kind of weird that this came out in 1998 when the next system also came out in 1998. But Yeah, really cool to get two pieces of Japanese game history with the Game Boy Lights gold one and a silver one. There were more that were released, but these gold and silver ones, these base models were really expensive to begin with. All of the um, all of the special edition versions of the Game Boy Light are really, really expensive. So I'm glad I got those two. I probably won't come across any more of those, but still cool to get. Also got them in those Japanese binges. So cool to get the 3 different versions of the original Game Boy. Next up is also released in 1998, which is kind of weird, so that the Game Boy Light was also released in 1998, was the Game Boy Color. So the Game Boy Color was released in 1998, and as you can probably guess, its entire purpose was to have a color screen. So the original Game Boy and all of its revisions just had kind of black and white screens on a green background, and so this one finally had color. The screen's still not very good like the original Game Boy, but at least it was in color. So for example, for the first time Pokemon was in color. It wasn't just black and white sprites anymore. So that was kind of a big deal. But it's also really weird because the Game Boy Light had this backlit screen, but when Nintendo came back to the Game Boy Color, the screen was back to the original. So it's kind of weird that they had the technological capability to have a bright screen, but they didn't follow through with it for future consoles, which is kind of weird. So I got this yellow one also sometime pre-pandemic because this is one of my consoles that was modded. I should have also mentioned this. The IPS mod, the IPS screen in the original Game Boy, helps make playing that a lot easier. I can actually play it. And same thing with the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color, not as weird of a screen, but it's a lot clearer with an IPS screen. So that's pretty cool. And I have one more Game Boy Color that came in one of those Japanese binges. It was a Game Boy Color Ice Blue model. So cool to have 2 Game Boy Colors and 2 Game Boy Lights and 3 pockets and an original Game Boy. But, that's beside the point. Moving forward is a weird one, and one you probably haven't heard of if you are not into collecting, and that would be the Bandai WonderSwan. So this was released in 1999 by Bandai only in Japan, and it was the last system that Gunpei Yokoi designed, worked on, prior to passing away in 1997. So if that name is not familiar, that's fine. I understand. Gunpei Yokoi worked on the Game & Watches that I mentioned before, Nintendo's first handheld item in the gaming market, as well as the Game Boy. So he had all this design and work on the 2 of the biggest Nintendo handheld up to that point. So he went and worked on the WonderSwan. If this was released in 99 and he passed away in 97, he didn't have a chance to see it released, but at least he was part of it and gave us the WonderSwan. So like I said, the WonderSwan was only released in Japan. And it's similar to the Game Boy in terms of display. Like you can kind of see it's got a green screen. Mine might be broken, so it might not work. But it did get revisions in 2000 and in 2002. The one in 2000 was kind of like a Game Boy Color revision that had color, and the one in 2002 was kind of like honestly kind of like a Game Boy Light revision where the screen was significantly clearer, and then it was discontinued. So it had a really, really short lifespan. I got it in a Japanese binge because it was super cheap to get it, so it's kind of cool to just get the handheld. I also didn't own any games for it until just a few weeks ago when I won a couple more auctions, so maybe at some point in the future we'll be seeing me talk about some WonderSwan games. But for now, just kind of another weird piece of Japanese gaming history, the WonderSwan. I should probably get this fixed, but yeah. Next up, we're going back to Nintendo. Most of the consoles in this video are Nintendo consoles just because Sony's PSP was not in my radar when I was growing up. I think I had all Nintendo consoles growing up, and of course the WonderSwan was in Japan. But, so with that said, we talked about this system not that long ago in the Childhood Games video, and that would be the Game Boy Advance. So, like I said, I grew up with a Game Boy Advance. It was my preschool graduation present, so lots of nostalgia for this one, and a system we talk about in just a few minutes. But this was released in 2001 as a successor to the Game Boy Color. It had overall improvements, especially in the games, but it still featured a very weak screen. That was kind of a problem for the Game Boy Advance until a certain revision that we'll talk about in just a moment. Like I said, it was my favorite system of all time when I was growing up. It definitely edges out the PlayStation 2 just because of the portability and the Nintendo games I played on it. But yeah, definitely love this one. So not this specific one that I'm holding in my hands, but I did have a Glacier Game Boy Advance when I was growing up. That's the one I got for the graduation. But then at some point I ended up selling a lot of games. We'll talk about that as we go. But sold my Game Boy Advance, got another one at some point in the past. And then just got the one that I had. And this is also one of the few that was modded to have a brighter screen. So the three that you see, the DMG Game Boy, the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, I can play on all these and not have to strain my eyes. So I love this one just because it looks like the one I had from when I was growing up. But I do have two more. I have a Hello Kitty Game Boy Advance, who unfortunately the screen is a little warped on the inside. The stickers are intact and it looks great, but yeah, the screen is a little messed up. You can play it, it just is a little warped. This came in a Japanese binge. We did not get a Hello Kitty Game Boy Advance in North America, so that's super cool. And one more that I got was this complete in box Japanese pink Game Boy Advance. I didn't have a pink one growing up, but the pink is kind of like the Glacier one. It's got a little translucent type of design to it. I didn't have a pink one, but I did have a friend that had a pink one growing up, so the pink is actually quite nice now that I have it. It was not my intention to own 3 pink consoles across Nintendo's first 3 systems, handheld system, but you know, these things kind of happen. Another one that I just got on the Japanese binge, so you can envision how much I spent on Japanese gaming systems. So with that said, we move on to the next console, the revision to the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, released in 2003, and it just had a different design. Obviously, you see the clamshell as opposed to the completely normal handheld, nothing to do with system. Still overall not great. It did end up getting a revision a couple years later. So the original model for the Game Boy Advance SP was a 001, that's what it's referred to, and the revision model was a 101, and the 101 finally brought in a better screen, so you could finally see what was going on the Game Boys. The best part about the Game Boy Advance SP is that it could play everything from the original Game Boy up to the Game Boy Advance. So if you're looking for a system to play Game Boy games, a Game Boy Advance SP is about as ultimate as you can get. What do my notes say here? I had a blue one when I was growing up, and it's kind of funny. I was looking through older pictures not that long ago, trying to look for info about the Childhood Games miniseries, and I actually saw that I had a blue Game Boy Advance SP. I knew I had one. I did not know when I got it. So I ended up selling that one along when I got my DS, right? We'll talk about that in the DS section, but it's very sad. I had a blue one, sold it, and then I ended up, the first time I went to my favorite game store of all time, they had 2 Game Boy Advance SPs. They had a 001 and a 101. Again, a not so great screen model and a good screen model, and I bought a good screen model the first time I ever went in there, and it was a lot cheaper than what it is now. All Game Boys have shot up in price, so it was cool to finally get an SP again. I was able to play games. I was finally, able to play Pokemon in its original form, so that was cool. But like I said, I got that Game Boy, and then basically there was this shuffle a couple months later where my little sister wanted to get a Game Boy for her birthday because she saw her older brother collecting older games. So there was this shuffle where I had to get another Game Boy Advance, and then she got my good model, and then I ended up getting a different Game Boy and had to mod that one. So it was kind of weird shuffle, but this is a nicely modded Game Boy Advance SP. This one has the IPS screen we keep talking about. This one doesn't need batteries, so I can actually show you. There you go, crystal clear. But also, this is not the original shell to the Game Boy Advance SP that I had. I bought a blue one, and when I was getting the screen upgraded, I also got the shell upgraded to this NES Type 1. And NES 1 was released, so this is not an official NES Game Boy Advance SP, but I do love the design a whole lot. So if I'm going to play a system for the rest of my life, it's probably the Game Boy Advance, probably this exact console right here. Also, tons of good memories with this, talking about the Game Boy Advance. My brother also had either a Pikachu one or a SpongeBob one, so that one is long gone. It's long lost, but it was cool that both of us had a Game Boy Advance SP growing up. yeah, okay, that's all I had to say about the SP. So I got a lot of notes here. When I was making this video, pulling out all the handhelds, I was like, I should probably get some dates about when these consoles came out. And we start to get into where I really started collecting multiple of a single system. So to this point, the most we have seen for a single console, for a single handheld console, is the Pocket and the Game Boy Advance with 3. And the wheels start to come off the bus in that regard here. So after the Game Boy Advance SP, the successor was the DS, the original DS in 2004, and it was completely overhauled. We have new game cartridges. We finally have better screens, more so in the revision of the original DS, but got a lot better with the DS system from the Game Boy Advance. Way more functionality, and I am super nostalgic for the DS. Not so much for this specific model. This is an original DS model from 2004, because the revision I am most familiar with is the DS Lite. So the reason why I'm so nostalgic for this is that for my 10th birthday, just a few years ago when the dinosaurs were running the earth, I got Pokemon Diamond, and I got my first DS, which is not this one in my hand, unfortunately. But I remember getting it that morning. I remember being like, Pokemon is totally it. That's all the life I need. And went to school that day, came home, and right away played Pokemon Diamond for the rest of the day. So in that childhood games video, I talked about playing Fire Red, but the first Pokemon game that I finished was Pokemon Diamond. So very, very nostalgic for the DS. And I have too many of these. So the original one I had was black. That's the one I got for my birthday. And then I ended up selling that black one for a DSi when the DSi was released. And we may or may not talk about the DSi in just a moment. But then working... Oh, so before that, I ended up getting this one right around the time I graduated. I had sold Pokemon Diamond, kind of in a... Not so much for the DSi, but in a gaming purge a couple years later when I was too cool to play video games. But when I went to go back and buy a DS, this is like right when I graduated high school, way pre-collecting. I was in a store in another state, and they had a DS, like this crimson and black DS Lite, so I ended up buying this one. So that's cool. But then I, of course, worked at a game store, and this is where things really started to get bad because I had access to many cool things. So I have just sitting here 4 more DS Lites. These are all North American DS Lites that came from the store. We had a plain white one. We have a plain pink one. But beyond just the plain white and plain pink, there was we call it rose gold pink. It's kind of like chromatic pink, which is very, very pretty. But one that I had never seen before it came in, not that it's any more rarer than the other ones, but it's a silver DS Lite, this kind of chromatic silver, like the chromatic pink system. So here's the problem with DS Lites. Game Boy Advances have shot up in price. They're very, very expensive because people want to play the original way of playing these systems. But DS Lites are actually pretty cheap. They're about $50 a pop. So getting even these really nice DS Lites I didn't have before, they still only cost me around $50 a piece, whereas Game Boys alone go for more than $50, which is kind of weird because the DS is capable of way more than the Game Boy Advance. But that's not where it stops for DS Lites, because then, of course, in Japanese binging, we came across a plain black one, and then a Nintendogs one. So this Nintendogs one was bundled with a Nintendogs game, or you could put it the other way and say a Nintendogs game was bundled with a system. Unfortunately, this one's broken. I think the screen is cracked down here, so I'd have to get that replaced. But I think when I have another 6-7 functional DS Lites, I probably don't need to get this one fixed right away, but it is cool to have a special edition one. And the last one for the plain DS Lites was this ice blue DS Lite that is complete in box from Japan. Also, Japan got way cooler DS Lite boxes. This very square one as opposed to the rectangular one North America got. And this one was a normal release in Japan, but I think on console variations, it's mentioned that this was intended for Mother's Day, which is kind of funny. The DS Lite was made for just about everybody. Just about everybody on the planet owned a DS Lite, so it's cool for that reason, but I'm curious to know if that's an actual thing that Console Variation said that it's a Mother's Day type system here in North America. So that's cool and dandy. You know, we're looking at 8 DS Lites and an original DS, and that's not where the DS systems stop, unfortunately, because released in 2008, 2 years after the DS Lite was released, was the DSi. And here's a single DSi. This is not the one I had growing up. This is a lime green one that was only released in Japan. We did get a similarly colored DS Lite that is lime green, but it was only bundled with personal trainer cooking. That's another weird thing. That's a very expensive system. But anyway, the DSi released in Japan in 2008 and brought here in North America just a few months later in 2009. It's just another DS with added functionality, but the sad part is that even though it has this online store for the first time, even though it has cameras and like a voice changing thing, it removed the Game Boy Advance slot, so you can only play DS games on a DSi as opposed to the DS Lite that was capable of playing DS games, and obviously Game Boy Advance cartridges, which is kind of sad, but it was an attempt to make things cheaper, right? Just another revision. However, there are a handful of DSi only games, which is kind of funny too. So here's a little story about the DS. I keep saying like I sold all my stuff. So this is not my DSi. Like I said, I had a light blue DSi. Like I think it was one of like the launch models for the DSi. So when that one was released, so it had to be 2009. It had to be 2009, I guess. I had Game Boys. I had a DS Lite, and I said I really want that new DSi. Of course, I'm young. I don't know. You know, I would go back and not sell everything if I could. But I ended up selling my DS, my Game Boys, and all my Game Boy games because I knew I couldn't play them anymore. That included Monsters, Inc., that I sold for 3 cents, which is crazy at GameStop. And then also Pokemon Fire Red that I sold for $10. And as we talked about in the childhood games video, that's quite sad. So the DSi, there's a little revenge in my blood, or I don't know what the word I'm looking for. There's a little heat in my blood talking about the DSi, but it's fine. It's cool to get another one. So I got this one, this light green one in the Japanese binge, and I also got this white DSi XL that came out in 2009 in Japan and 2010 here in North America, which is really cool. This thing is humongous. The first XL system for DSs that we may or may not talk about in just a second again. But the blue one I did have, that one was sold in basically a gaming purge a couple of years later. I don't know when it was, but there was a time that I'm like, I'm too cool to play Nintendo games, so I ended up selling my my DSs and everything. So that was kind of sad. But my sister does have a blue DSi, so if I ever want my specific DSi back, or the same model of one that I had, it's, you know, I can find it pretty quick. So that's kind of cool, but that is the end for regular DSs. What's the word I'm looking for? Emphasis on regular DSs, because in 2011 the 3DS was released, and I did not have a 3DS because, again, that was around the time that I did not play Nintendo games, barely played video games at all. I think at that time, if I'm playing anything, I'm playing the PlayStation 2. So that was in 2011, but it wasn't until 2014 that the new Nintendo 3DS series line of systems was released. So it was just, so there was the 3DS, and then there was like a 3DS XL, and then there was a 2DS, which just took away some of the 3DS functionality. As it sounds, also the 3DS is capable of 3D capability, which is pretty cool, and also just way more power than a regular DS. But it was in 2015 that new 3DS line was brought to North America, and then I finally got one just this past April. So we talked about this in a Months in Review not that long ago either, that I never had a 3DS, like I just said, but then I finally got this one because I said if I'm going to buy a single 3DS, I might as well get the best possible version. This is a new 3DS XL, so the new is more powerful. The XL is just a bigger one, bigger screen the better. And when I heard the 3DS eShop was closing, I made it a priority to finally get one. They announced that in 2022 for closure in 2023, so I was supposed to get a 3DS back a year ago, never ended up doing it, but now I have it. So I don't have access to the eShop anymore, but at least I finally have a 3DS. And you might be wondering why I don't have a ton of 3DSs. It's because 3DSs are really expensive. that one, special edition model, complete in box, way more expensive than any DS, but even regular 3DS models can go for 100, even 2DS models go for 100, so not as easy to just buy a whole bunch. So I probably won't collect many 3DS systems. There's a few that I want, a handful of Japanese 2DSs that were based on the original Pokemon games. I want those. This is a Super Nintendo 3DS XL. I would like to get the Super Famicom equivalent in Japan. But yeah, it's going to take a while to get those. So I've been playing my 3DS recently, playing some games. Not even 3DS games. I'm still playing DS games just to get the comfort of the system, and I absolutely love it. So I will be collecting more 3DS games in the near future. So that's a 3DS. You know I own some Switches, but we got to get there. But moving forward, I talked about Game & Watches in the beginning. Game & Watch was the handheld systems before the original Game Boy, and those were more just like LCD games. The first one was released in 1980. Again, the original Game Boy was released in 1989. So those were just like single games, not cartridge-based systems that just played high-score-based games. But in 2020, Nintendo decided to bring back some like limited edition Game & Watches. So obviously was not a collector before that, or not long before that. So when they announced these special edition ones, I decided to get them. The first one was for Mario's 35th anniversary. It's a Super Mario Game & Watch, and they were like, these are going to be in really, really short stock, so you got to make sure you get them, kind of like the Mario 3D All-Stars game. So I was like, oh, wow. Well, if they're in high demand, I got to get two, one to keep sealed and one to play. You could find these eons after it was discontinued. They have not held their value at all. So now I have two. I've played one of them, as you can see. The other one is still sealed, so kind of silly, but I'll never get my money back on a Game & Watch system like this. So just a cool piece of gaming history, but they weren't actually that limited. But they did do one more re-release, a Legend of Zelda one for Zelda's 35th anniversary in 2021. So even though I have very little connection to these Game & Watches, they are cool pieces of history, and they are technically handhelds. So we're going to get a little weird before we talk about the Switches. The first one is one I absolutely adore, and it's this thing right here. This is just a bag, but if we take out the bag, there's a box, and in the box, there is a chicken nugget. This was a Chinese McDonald's Happy Meal toy. It is shaped like a chicken nugget, that's the point, and this plays Tetris. A ever so slightly scaled down version of Tetris, but no joke. In China, they did a Tetris crossover, if you will, where they did these Happy Meal toys that look like chicken nuggets but play Tetris. So that is really, really funny. That was last year. It was only last year in 2023. So I remember going to Too Many Games, maybe a few weeks ago. But Too Many Games in 2023, checking to see if anybody had it. When I saw that nobody had the Tetris chicken nugget, I had to order one online. So that's a very silly handheld, but it's still a handheld nonetheless. And before we get to the Switches, we got to talk about some bootlegs. I rarely talk about bootlegs here because they're not official, but we got some funny ones here that go along with what we're talking about. They're handhelds. The first one is the GB Boy Color, but color spelled in the European way with COLOUR. This came into the game store. It is a Game Boy Color knockoff, if you can't tell, but this one has a built-in bright screen right away. So even though it is not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, definitely a Chinese knockoff, it's still kind of funny to have a GB Boy Color, or as instead of color, it's color, as us Americans would word it. So kind of silly to have that. Another weird one is this PvP Station Lite 3000. So definitely not a PSP, absolutely not. It's a PvP Station Lite 3000. So that's very, very important. I think I saw this somewhere, or like some YouTuber talked about it, and then I just decided to get one because it was like $20 on eBay. And I you could get really deep buying bootleg consoles on eBay. So I'm probably not doing much of that anymore, but still kind of funny. And the last two were actually a birthday present from a friend this past year, because he said we can do all sorts of stuff on them. I'm not going to lie, Mike, if you're watching, I'm sorry. I don't remember which one was the good emulation one and which one was the joking one, but there's the Game Box Plus, definitely not a Game Boy knockoff at all. And then there's the Game Console. I think this is the good one. Definitely also not a Game Boy knockoff whatsoever. So, Game Box and Game Console, naturally. So, with that all said, we finally get to the system that needs no introduction in today's world, the Nintendo Switch, released in 2017, and it's obviously just one of the best consoles of all time. We're working towards getting the Switch to more than the PlayStation 2 number of units. Best system of all, greatest selling system of all time, but we got to get the Switch over that. So I didn't get one until 2021. It was still kind of the phase of like, I'm too cool for gaming, so I didn't need a Switch. I was like, I'm good playing NHL on my PS4. That only takes you so far. So it wasn't until the OLED was announced and released in early October 2021 that I said, okay, I don't have a Switch. I might as well get the newest model of the Switch if I'm going to buy one anyway. So I got just a plain OLED Switch. I got the red and blue. At the time, it was also released with an all-white one with a white dock and white Joy-Cons. I would like to get that one too at some point, but at the very least, I don't need to get it separately. I can just kind of buy a white dock. But yeah, this one has unlocked a lot of collecting habits, a lot of Switch games being bought, but also I absolutely love playing on my Switch. But this is not the only handheld Switch, not the only Switch that I own. Of other handheld systems that I have, I got to complete all the Switches here, right? So the next one I got was October 2021. I then got, the reason I got the OLED in the first place was because Pokemon Game Freak was remaking Diamond, Pokemon Diamond. So talked about nostalgia earlier with Pokemon Diamond, and they were remaking it. So I had to get a Switch, and then along with the release of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the remakes, was a Switch Lite. So I got an OLED in October, and then the games came out in November, and then I proceeded to buy the Switch Lite. I had a friend who was working at Target, pulled one off the shelf for me. Very kind of that person. And then I had a Switch Lite. And I wanted two Switches because I wanted to be able to trade between my two games without having to use the internet. And that's really why I used it. And I still use it now for when I was playing Scarlet and Violet. But speaking of Scarlet and Violet, I also then proceeded to get the Scarlet and Violet OLED when that was released. Was that last year already? A year and a half ago at this point, right? 2022. I got the Scarlet and Violet OLED because it's Pokemon and addiction. And then, so that's another Pokemon Switch. And then the last Switch that I have bought is another Pokemon Switch. I got a Japanese Sword and Shield Switch Lite. So this was not necessarily in the Japanese binge of when I did it, but it is in between the time that I got the Scarlet and Violet OLED and now, obviously. So this was a cool one to get because now I'm only missing one single Pokemon Switch. I'm missing the Let's Go one. So we're gonna get that one soon. I also do want to get, I'm not a Legend of Zelda fan, never played Legend of Zelda, but I do really want to get the Legend of Zelda Switch Lite that's coming out in the fall, the all gold one for, what's the game called? Echoes of Wisdom? Yeah, I definitely want to get that. So console collecting is not going to end here. But yeah, this was a lot of systems, so thank you so much for sticking around. The sun is a little darker, or the sun is kind of gone. It's thundering outside. I don't know if you can hear it on the video. My hair's a little drier, but this was a lot of fun to talk about. So sincerely, thank you so much for watching, for sticking around this long. If there's something about these systems that I missed, please let me know. I would love to learn more about the systems, hopefully as much as I have taught you something. So with that said, bye.